Okay. Today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Lamed Aleph. We're going to start the Mishnah on Lamed Amabez. We're going to start the Mishnah on 30b. The Mishnah states that we're talking about a case from our opening Mishnah where there were 15 relatives, and those 15 relatives, their co-wives were prohibited to do Yibum or Chalitza. Just like the relatives themselves are prohibited in Yibum or Chalitza, so too are the co-wives, and the co-wives immediately were released to the marketplace to marry whoever they want. So the Mishnah says, but in all those cases, all of those 15 relatives, Sha'ayuba and Kedushin or Gerushin, if they themselves had a betrothal, the relatives were Gerushin Besafik, if the betrothal was in a doubt, or the divorce was in a doubt, then their co-wives can only do Chalitza but not Yibum. So the Gemara asks, the Mishnah says, Ketzad Safek Kedushin. What does it mean to have a doubtful betrothal, that you're not sure if it's a betrothal? So the Mishnah explains, Zarakla Kedushin, Safek Karvo. If you throw to her a document of a betrothal, you're not sure if it actually was closer to her or closer to him, Zeo Safek Kedushin. That's what's called a doubt about a Kedushin. What's called a doubt about Gerushin? What's called a doubt about divorce? So the Mishnah explains, biblically speaking, there requires witnesses. So let's say he wrote with his own hand, but there are no witnesses on it. Or alternatively, Yeshel Avedin, there are witnesses, but there's no date. Or alternatively, Yesh Bozman, or alternatively, let's say there's a time, but there's only one witness. All these cases are called Zeo Safek Gerushin. This is what's called a doubt about a divorce. So the Gemara says Gerushin, but when it comes to Gerushin, then we say when it comes to divorce, we don't list the same cases as Kedushin. By Kedushin, it says it's a doubt whether it's betrothal, whether it's closer to her or closer to him. But by Gerushin, we don't say that. Gerushin, the same case by divorce, we don't say Safek Karvo. It doesn't say this case whether it's closer to her or closer to him. My time, what's the reasoning? Rabba explains, the reason why we don't say the same case by Gerushin, whereas we say it by Kedushin. So first we're going to have the first answer of Rabba, that'll take up most of the next daf. Then on the next page we'll have the answer of Abaye. But Rabba says the reason is, Isha zu b'chaskas heter v'shukol medes. This woman was in the presumptive status of being permitted to marry to the marketplace, because we say that most likely she was married to this, that she had been married to her relative, that she was the co-wife of her relative, and so therefore, since she was the co-wife of her relative, now we just want to say out of a doubt that she's divorced. But when she was the co-wife of the relative, there was no Yibum or Chalisa. She was allowed to go to the marketplace and marry whoever she wanted. So therefore, she was in the presumptive status of being allowed to marry to the marketplace. When we safek and out of a doubt, you want to prohibit her out of a doubt. Don't prohibit her out of a situation of a doubt. So therefore, she's allowed to marry to the marketplace. So don't say this case of whether it was closer to her or closer to him. So Amar Abaye, Hachi b'kedushin nami. So if that's the case, why do we list this case by Kedushin? Why don't we say the same thing? This woman, before her co-wife became married and the relative became married, she was permitted to do Yibum. And now you want to say out of the doubt whether or not the relative was betrothed, now you want to prohibit the co-wife from doing Yibum. Don't prohibit her out of a doubt. Let her do Yibum to the brother-in-law. Gemara says, no, there we're just going to be strict, and we're going to say out of a stringency we'll require chalitza. The Gemara says, well, what are you talking about? That's a stringency that will lead to a leniency, because zimnin da'azel, we're going to say, oh, we're not sure if she's betrothed. She's probably not betrothed because we're requiring chalitza on the tsar, on the co-wife, and so therefore what he's going to do is he's going to go and betroth her sister. He's not allowed to betroth her sister, and he's going to be with her sister, and that's a prohibition. Or alternatively, or else somebody else will come along and betroth the woman who was doubtfully betrothed, and will say, I'm certainly betrothed to you, and that's going to be a problem because maybe she's already betrothed to the other person. V'kiven asar lamar tzara yavume. And since we're prohibiting the co-wife to do yibum, Amri dekama kedushin ubasar lav kedushin. And since we're going to say that under those circumstances the co-wife is not allowed to do yibum, we're going to say, oh, it must be that the first kedushin was a kedushin, and therefore that's the reason why we don't allow yibum. With the basar lav kedushin, and the latter one is not kedushin, and it's going to create all sorts of problems. Gemara says, no, we're not worried about that. What Gemara says on top of Amud Aleph, Kivan the kamitrachas chalitza, because since we require chalitza in those circumstances, then made the idea, then everybody will know the chumra ba'amo. Everybody will know, look, the only reason why she doesn't do yibum is out of astringency, because we're requiring chalitza. So therefore they'll know that really technically speaking, that given the mitrachas chalitza, since we're going to require chalitza on since we're requiring chalitza in this latter case, then made the idea, then everybody will know the chumra ba'almahu, that it's really just a stringency that we're saying that we require the chalitza, and that technically speaking, that technically speaking she really could do yibum, but we're requiring chalitza because technically speaking she's not married. Look, Rashi says everybody will know the kedusha the bas achiv lav kedushin. Everybody will know it's not a kedushin. And the reason why we don't allow yibum of the co-wife is just a stringency. So the Gemara says, but the Gemara says if that's the case, gerushin nami listening. By gerushin we should have the same case by divorce. We should say that that the case of gerushin is safek karva. It's a doubt whether it's closer to her or to him. We should require chalitza, made a yadi, and then everybody will know the chumra ba'almahu, that it's really just a stringency, and out of we're doing the chalitza out of a stringency. The Gemara says no. If you're going to say she do the chalitza out of a stringency, then what's going to happen is misyabemis, that she might come to do yibum in the case of gerushin, and really she can't do yibum there. Why can't she? Because she's still married. Because it's a suffix gerushin, so the erva is still married, and so she's not allowed to do gerushin there. Gemara says, "Hachanami here too in this case also." Why don't we say the same thing by kedushin? If you're going to say you do chalitza, then misya bemes, then she's going to do yibum. Gemara says, but so what? If she does the yibum by the kedushin, it's not really going to be as big a problem because technically speaking, she can do yibum, because we're going to say that we assume the presumptive status was she was not married. The Gemara explains, but if she actually would do yibum by the case of kedushin, it wouldn't be a big deal because she would retain the same presumptive status, and the same presumptive status was that she was not married. So therefore, that would be okay. So the Gemara says, Abaye challenges this idea. Well, how does Abaye challenge this answer of Rabbah? Again, what was the answer of Rabbah? The answer of Rabbah, the reason why we don't say that we should do chalitza for the suffix gerushin is because then we might come to do yibum. So therefore we don't include that case in the Mishnah. So Abaye challenges this idea because we have a case. What's the circumstance? We have the case where nafal Abaye salav. Let's say there's two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven is married to two women. He's married to Shimon's daughter, who is Rachel, and he's also married to another co-wife, we'll call her Sarah. And then a house fell upon him, and Abbas Achav, and fell on Rachel at the same time. Then you do a man mace. We don't know who died first. Then you do a man mace rishon. We don't know if Reuven died first, in which case Sarah would not do yibum with Shimon because she was the co-wife of his relative, and so she's exempt. Or maybe Rachel died first, in which case Sarah would fall to yibum with Shimon because her co-wife was not her co-wife at the time that her husband died. So we don't know who died first. So we say there, there we require chalitza, not yibum. But here too, why don't we say why don't we say the same concept that Rabbah was suggesting? This at the time, her presumptive status was that she doesn't fall to yibum because she's the co-wife of a relative. And you want to prohibit her only out of a doubt. Don't prohibit her out of a doubt. So it's v'chitema. And if you want to say, so this is a question on Rabbah, because Rabbah says you don't do chalitza, but here they do chalitza. And if you want to say if you want to say that the whole reason why we do it here is out of a stringency, it's a stringency that's going to lead to leniency. If you're going to tell her to do chalitza, misya bemes, then in the end she'll do yibam also, and that's a big problem. So the Gemara says, no, by gerushin, by a case of divorce, where divorce is very common, the rabbis decreed that you don't do chalitza because they were worried that it might come to do yibam. But by the case of a building falling down, the lo shlichi, it's not common at all. So therefore, the rabbis didn't make the decree, and therefore they said chalitza because they weren't worried about they weren't worried about, since it was uncommon, the rabbis didn't make those decrees. Or inami, or alternatively, gerushin, by gerushin, the kaima erva, by the divorce, where the relative, the co-wife who is a relative is right in front of us, and so therefore the kamuchach, so it proves that, let's say it proves that she's divorced. Look at Rashi. Rashi says this here. He says the kaima erva kaman, the relative is in front of us. The kamuchachas that call Rowan, and everybody sees it, that she was the co-wife of the relative, and now you require chalitza. Then people come to say that it was a divorce. Then people come to say that it was a valid divorce, and therefore she's not the co-wife of a relative, and she'll come to do yibum. But in our case, mapoes mikamubu rabbanan mapoes. How would the rabbis ever know if you're going to require chalitza? Who's going to say that the rabbis knew what happened? These judges will require chalitza. Were they prophets that they knew anything? That they didn't know what happened there, and so therefore they must have known. Everybody will know that the chalitza was done out of a suffix, out of a doubt. We're on the Lamed Aleph, Amid Aleph. Everybody would know, but in the case of earthquake, that it was done out of a doubt. So the Gemara says, the Gabe Gerushin Milotanan. But is this really the case by divorce that we don't require a chalitza? But didn't we learn? So medes kershus hara. And let's say a person standing in the public domain, v'zarkula. If a person was standing in the public domain, v'zarkula, and he throws the get to her, karavwa, if it gets closer to her, megureshes. It's closer to her, she's divorced. Karavwa, it's closer to him, ain't a megureshes. She's not divorced. Mechza, if it's 50-50, megureshes, ain't a megureshes. It's a doubtful divorce case. And we ask why. What the doubtful divorce means? It's an ambiguous case. It's a suffix. And we said, for what do we need this? What's the reason? The kohen, if he's a kohen, asurale, she's going to be prohibited to him. The erva, and if she was an erva, if the co-wife was, if the one who was doubtful divorce was an erva, we would say tarasa by chalitza, that the co-wife requires chalitza. So there we see in that specific case of a doubtful divorce that the co-wife does require chalitza. Below Amrinon, and we don't say we don't say we're concerned that if you're going to say you do chalitza, you do yibam. So therefore, we have a direct case that proves not like Rabbah taught. Mar says, but we explained that. What was that case talking about? It was two different types of doubts. Our doubt here is where you threw it and you're not sure who it's closer to, but that's a different doubt. Because what's the doubt there? What are we talking about here? We're dealing with two separate groups of witnesses. One says that the divorce was closer to her. And the other one says it was closer to him. But since you have two completely separate groups of witnesses, that's no longer considered a rabbinic doubt. That's called that's called a biblical doubt. That's called the shmeika d'araisa. That's called a biblical doubt. And since it's a biblical doubt, so therefore we're going to be strict and require chalitza. Umas Nisan in our Mishnah Da'acha Bekas Achas. Our Mishnah over here is with one group of witnesses. And so therefore, since it's with one group of witnesses, since our Mishnah Davo is fake to Rabbanan, it's considered a rabbinic doubt. And so therefore, we're not going to require Chalitza, we're going to put it on the presumptive status. Gemara says, how do we know that our group of witnesses is with one? Our doubt over here in our Mishnah is with one group of witnesses. Gemara says, Dumya de Kedushin, because it's similar to the case of Kedushin. Ma Kedushin, just like the case of Kedushin is Bekat Achas, just like the case of Kedushin is with one group of witnesses. Av Kerusha Bekat Achas, so too the case of a divorce is with one group of witnesses. Gemara says, Kedushin Gufayo Mimai Bekat Achas. And how do we know that Kedushin itself? And how do we know that the Kedushin itself is with one group of witnesses? Maybe the Kedushin is also with two groups of witnesses. The Gemara says no. Even Beis Kitei Edim, if the Kedushin was with two groups of witnesses, if the Kedushin was with two groups of witnesses, then what we would say is, then that which we said, why did we say that she should do Yibum in the case where we say that by the Kedushin do Chalitza, and we're not concerned she'll do Yibum because it's no big deal. But if we would actually say that there would be cases of two groups of witnesses, then it would be a big deal. Then we would be saying, if there are witnesses who are saying she's actually betrothed, and you still say she could do Yibum with the co-wife, could do Yibum with the brother, we know it would never fly. Furthermore, with two groups of witnesses, the Gemara says, first of all, another problem. Even if you say it's two groups of witnesses, by the case of divorce, that's still going to be a case that's a biblical doubt. Because we would say by the case of the Gitin, you would say that the two witnesses go against the other two witnesses. And the woman would be in her presumptive status. So even by Kedushin, if it's two groups of witnesses, we would still say that it's a doubt. That we would still say it's a rabbinic doubt. Hold on 1 second. So, by the two groups of witnesses, by the cases of divorce, we would still say it's a rabbinic doubt because we have two groups of witnesses against the other one, and each one would say that. So we would keep up the presumptive status, and so therefore, since we're keeping up the presumptive status, it's not a biblical doubt; it's a rabbinic doubt. That's the Gemara's question. It's like the case of the possessions of the person who's called Bar Shataya. The Bar Shataya, maybe it also means the foolish man, because this guy Bar Shataya, Zabin Nechse, he sold his possessions. Also betrayed. Two people came along. They sold him when he was healthy. It's a valid sale. Also betrayed. They say he sold it when he was a foolish man or insane. And let's put the two against each other. We're on top of Lamed Aleph from base. And we're going to establish that the land is in his possession. And so we see from here that even if it's two against two, we're going to establish the presumptive status. And so therefore, also in our case, we're going to say that the woman is going to retain her presumptive status, that she's the co-wife of a relative, and she should be allowed to marry into the marketplace. And so from the fact that the rabbi said in the Brisa that she has to do chalitza, it's proof that they weren't concerned that they're going to say that because you do chalitza, you're going to come to do yibum. And so too also in the case of gerushin in our Mishnah, we should say this case of that she should require chalitza. So therefore, the Gemara has a big problem with Rabba's answer. So therefore, Abaye says, what's the reason why we have the case by Kedushin and not by Gerushin? The answer is, there's no reason. The answer is because they're both the same. Amar Abaye, Yagido Lavreyo. Abaye says, your friend should testify about him. This is a verse. The verse says in Job, Yagido Lavreyo. So that's the verse from Job. His friend will testify. Meaning to say, Tana Kedushin, who are doing Gerushin. The Mishnah talks about Kedushin, but it's the same law by Gerushin. And so too, kind of a gerish in the cases by divorce or adil kedushin, and the same thing by kedushin. So Rava says, what are you talking about? Our Mishnah says this is the laws of the kedushin. Zel, what is the actual lashon of the Mishnah? The actual lashon of the Mishnah was Zel Safek Kedushin. This is a case of Safek Kedushin, as opposed to meaning to say this is the case of Safek Kedushin. Meaning to say that implies that it's excluding something and saying that the other cases are not Safek Kedushin. And in the other cases, where she does chalitza not yiva. So why does it say that if it's including Gerushin in it? So Rava says the cases that are listed for kedushin, they also apply to Gerushin. The cases by Gerushin, there are those masha'im b'kedushin that don't apply to kedushin. V'zeu the Gerushin, and when it says this is the case of Gerushin, lav davka, it's not specific. El mishum detana zeu b'kedushin, because it says this is the case by kedushin, kaninami zeu b'gerushin. It also states it by Gerushin. V'zeu the Gerushin, and when it says this is the case of kedushin, l'miyute mai, what's it coming to exclude? L'miyute zman deleka b'kedushin. It's coming to include a case where you didn't put the date in the kedushin, that's not going to be considered. That's not considered suffix. That's a valid document. And the Mishnah and the Gemara continues to make ma lo teknu zman b'kedushin. Why didn't they put the time and date in the kedushin? Gemara says, well, I'll tell you why. There's one person who says that the only reason why they put the time and the date in a document is because of money, and so therefore we want to know if they're fully married that the husband gets the dividends of the wife's assets. But but when they're just betrothed, the husband doesn't get those dividends, so they didn't put it in. But according to the one who says that the whole concern is that if Reuven married his brother's niece, and if we put the time and date in, he might come to have mercy on her when she was adulterous, and not sentence her to death. So therefore, we want to know exactly the time she was adulterous. So if that's the case, Liskin's mind, you should have put the date in the kedushin. So what's the reason why we don't have a date in the kedushin document? Because there's some people who betroth with money and some people with a contract. And so therefore, we'll tikkun rabbanan's man. So since if somebody's going to be put into betrothing with the money, you don't have a date on it. So therefore, they didn't put it in the contract. So but what about a slave? But when a slave wants to acquire his freedom, sometimes he does it with money, and sometimes he does it with a contract. And still the rabbi said whenever the slave acquires his contract, you have to put in the time. Whenever he acquires his freedom, you put in the date. Mar explains, there, by the slave, most people do it by a contract, but by a kedushin, most people do it with money. So therefore, the rabbi is instituted by money, by a slave, but not by betrothal. By same alternatively, it's not possible. There's no way to do it because how would we put the date in the betrothal document? How would we ever do it? Because what would we do? It's not possible. Because if we put the date in, we'll leave it with her. If she was adulterous, she'll just erase it since she has the contract. We're going to leave the contract with him. No, so sometimes a person who was he betrothed to was his niece, and he'll have mercy on her and he'll erase it. Leave it with the Edim, if they remember then the date, then they'll just come and testify. They don't need the contract. And if they don't remember, sometimes they'll just remind themselves by looking at the contract of the testimony. Rahmana says, we only trust them. We don't trust their their written testimony. So that meaning to say they're not allowed to jog their memory by looking at their written testimony. So therefore, that's not it's crazy. But we only accept their memory better than their written testimony. The Gemara says, "Well, Yachid begerish nami." Well, if that's the case, by a case of divorce, also we shouldn't trust the date in it. Why do we write the date in the document? Gemara says no. The difference is the name of it. So Gemara says, if she has a date in the divorce, she's not going to erase it because she'll prove I'm divorced. I wasn't adulterous. But if she has a date in the betrothal document, that's going to prove when she was adulterous. So therefore, she's going to try to erase it. Okay, we'll stop here. God willing, pick this up tomorrow. If anybody has any questions, happy to address them.